They sold her for the price of a debt. Haley Duncan watched the paper tremble beneath her finger and felt the tremor run through the rest of her body as if the signature could ripple outward and reassemble everything that had become broken. The unpaid bills, her mother's prescriptions, the threats her stepfather made in the dark corners of the house. Outside, rain ran down like a wash of gray, erasing the streetlights. Inside the cramped office, the man across from her did not move the way people moving with pity move. He moved with calculation. He offered numbers, terms, a signature line. Haley thought of her brother, of the tuition that would vanish if she could pay just enough to buy another month of safety. Will Duncan, her stepfather, loud and dangerous, and owed money he'd never managed to earn honestly, had found a man who would cover the ledger. A man with a name that opened doors and closed mouths. Charles Lewis. Haley imagined the name in a headline, and it felt like a lie she had been hired to act. The contract was clinical: monthly support, anonymity clauses, public appearances on request, in-name-only marriage for 5 years. No children clause was printed in bold, but crossed out in the hand of the attorney that sat between them. Grandpa Lewis had already spoken several times over the call that morning. An heir, a legacy, a name on a ledger that had nothing to do with love. She signed because she had to. The pen trembled less than her hand. When the ink dried, it was as if someone else had closed a gate on her life. Will grinned in the same room, as though he had never known the cost. Half an hour later, the municipal clerk stamped the marriage certificate. No vows, no roses, a paper too thick to tear. Haley's eyes chased the corner of a folder that held a photograph, a carefully cropped image of Charles on the cover of a magazine, the kind with perfect teeth and a jaw that suggested you could not question him in public. Beside that, someone had left a small velvet box with a ring the size of a smug promise. He never saw it. Charles was already a half step away, his coat bunched over his shoulder, his gaze on everything but her. The first time she saw his house, it took her breath in a way that had nothing to do with romance and everything to do with the literal width of the marble foyer, the echo of her heels on floors polished to forgetfulness. Security moved like a forest. Men in black jackets and name tags were branches, unmoving and watchful. Haley felt at once exposed and protected, a contradiction that lived under the same roof. A craft-stitched hallway led to rooms that smelled of citron and polished wood. Servants moved with choreographed quiet. Portraits watched her as if they were already part of the family. Grandpa Lewis was the first to speak to her properly. He was small in stature and vast in expectation. His eyes were flinty but not unkind. He took Haley's hands, not letting the conversation tip toward the transactional. He framed it instead as duty. "You must understand," he said. "This house has held a lot. It asks for steadiness. It asks only that you do your part." His voice sounded like someone trying to make mercy into a rule. Charles listened to their arrangement as if it were wind against a window. He was the kind of man who had made the world learn to look at him and then look away when it was inconvenient. Publicly untouchable, privately inaccessible. In private, though, he had a hand that folded around the rim of a cup when he thought no one was watching. Those tiny gestures accumulated into a portrait Haley could not yet read. He did not move to claim the ring at the ceremony. He did not smile at her. When he spoke to her, it was with a precision that felt like an unexamined habit rather than a kindness. "Keep to the agreement," he said once in the kitchen, the cupboard doors of the mansion closing their mouths behind them. "Appearances matter. I will provide what has been promised. You will do what is asked." She left the kitchen with the taste of lemon in her mouth and the echo of that sentence settling like ice. It could have been a warning. It could have been safety. The first weeks were a study in contrasts. Haley's old life had been a jumble of cramped apartments and cheap coffee. Here, her coffee came in porcelain that never collected a ring. The company where Charles held court was a gilded machine, offices with glass that looked as though they could contain sunlight, design boards showing charms and stones, the Lewis name on a facade that never aged. Still, the corridors had a current that pulled at Haley like an undertow. People who had been born into this economy glanced up and measured her. They saw a girl with a last name borrowed in ink and a life apparently bought to match. She was placed in the design department, not as a figurehead, but as a practical addition. Some of the board members wanted to remodel a philanthropic line, and Haley had talent with textures, with the way metal caught light. That was how she told herself it would be bearable. If she could lose herself in work, she could keep her head clear. Anna Jones introduced herself like a storm front. Anna had been in the company long enough to be certain that she deserved it all. Blonde hair combed into a corporate halo, eyes that measured for leverage. "Welcome," Anna said with a smile that sharpened like a blade. "You must be the new Mrs. Lewis." The words were meant kindly, but there was an edge there, a claim that this place was hers to patrol. Haley learned to keep her shoulders even. At her desk, there were tiny signs of hostility. Missed emails, drafts with sentences deleted, a comment on a mock-up that looked like a trap. "We should keep things consistent with the Lewis aesthetic." People watched her the way a wave watches a rock, then decides its own course. Cody Morgan was a different syntax in her life, a steady voice on the other side of the line. They had grown up near the same scrappy block, and Cody had a knack for being present in ways people like him sometimes were not. He worked at a local repair shop and had an easy laugh that didn't care about marble. He brought her chicken soup on days when the house felt too big and the night too long. He did not offer judgment. He offered a listening room. "You look like a ghost," Cody told her once, sitting on the end of her borrowed bed and avoiding the subject of money. "You don't belong to anyone who hurts you." Haley laughed then, and it was thin. "I belong to the paperwork now," she said, "and to a man who once smiled on a magazine cover." "Then smile back," Cody said, half joking, half serious, and folded his hands like a man who thought he could conjure up a life by force of optimism. There were small things that did not line up. A staffer who avoided eye contact in the corridor, a security man who lingered too long over a set of keys and then looked away. One afternoon, while tidying a shelf in the design studio, Haley found a tuft of fabric caught in the hinges of a drawer. A piece of the same green silk used in a charity evening gown the company had produced last season. It was normal and unreal at once. The company that made jewelry and stories had things that bled into the margins, small debris of private lives. Haley pocketed the thread because she thought she might need it later, as proof that she had once touched this place and not been swallowed by it. "You're under a lot of scrutiny," said Maya, the studio assistant who had taken to bringing extra pens to Haley's desk. She had dark circles that read like a witness statement. "If you need me to fix anything, routing, schedules, I can do it." Haley considered how much of her life was now monitored. "How do you mean?" Maya shrugged. "Camera coverage, photo permissions, the board likes order." The words were carefully neutral, but Haley felt a tilt in them. Someone had already set a grid in motion that she had not been taught to navigate. At night, the mansion settled into its own shape. Haley learned to sleep with the curtains open because she was terrified of the dog swallowing the room where she sometimes pretended she would be generous with joy. There were rules she had not signed for. Do not use the private elevator after midnight. Always answer calls from the house. Do not go out alone without an escort. The house did not say it in those exact words. It placed the rules inside smiles that meant for your safety and eyes that meant for our peace. Grandpa Lewis believed in lineage as if it were a garden that required labor and vigilance, the right people pulling weeds. He visited Haley with a frequency that felt like fencing. "An heir," he said again, as though repeating a prayer. "We have waited." It set something heavy on Haley's chest. She had not wanted a child under these circumstances. She had wanted to survive. But when the news came, it was not a plan she made with the fine ink of contracts. It came on a Wednesday morning in a bathroom stall, her hands shaking, a small plastic stick held like proof of the impossible. She had not told Charles. She could not yet. The rules of this arrangement were a map she had not learned by heart. She texted Cody instead, because he had been the one who told her not to disappear. Her phone vibrated in her palm like a secret. "Are you sure?" Cody wrote. "As sure as I can be," Haley typed back, which was not the same as certainty, but it was the only truth she had. She thought of Grandpa's voice and the way the house would tilt toward her if she became what it wanted. Panic threaded with a sudden raw hope. Somewhere in the conflict, there was a life forming that had nothing to do with signatures or debt. Haley permitted herself to breathe in the idea for a minute too long. Then the ripple began. A photograph appeared on a company-wide chat later that afternoon. Someone had captured a mock-up of a press event, the design team in a rehearsal for an upcoming launch. The image was harmless, taken from the far side of the room. Haley's face was a little turned, her hand resting on a mock necklace. Someone circled her in red with a caption, "Brand mismatch?" The implication was not subtle. The new Mrs. Lewis was wrong for the company image. Anna's message was a single line, "This will not do." Haley felt the room narrow, her inbox filled with polite but cold messages that suggested concern for brand integrity and private conversations about the rightness of her presence. There was no need for the language to threaten. The exclusion was a weapon in itself. That evening, Charles asked for a meeting in his office. She arrived to find the space dominated by a single bookcase of awards. He did not close the door all the way. "How are you finding it?" he asked. Haley premised her answer on work. "The team is skilled. It's all learning curves." "You seem unsettled," he said. "If there's anything I should know." She almost told him then. She almost let the truth fall out of the contract like a loose coin. But she remembered Will's grin, the shape of the ledger, the sound of her mother's voice on the phone when Haley had explained the arrangement. "I'm fine," she said. "I'm learning." He watched her a long minute, then he reached into a drawer and removed a small box. Inside there was a pendant, a thin oval of jade threaded through with a chain. It had been given to him by his grandmother, he said, and it was meant to be with the family. He held it out like a peace offering. "For steadiness," he said simply. Haley felt the weight of it, as if it were an anchor dropped into the middle of her chest. He did not have to touch her to claim a boundary. The pendant could be a kindness. It could be a token. It could be a way to watch her more closely, to have something of hers to hold without permission if things turned. She took it because refusal would invite questions, and because there were mercies in small things. Late that week, Haley sat at the kitchen table and wrote a list of things she would do to safeguard herself. Document everything, record, keep Cody informed, do not sign anything without a witness. It felt like putting up a fence of Post-it notes against a tide. On a Thursday morning, she found a missed call from her mother and a message that read simply, "I'll be okay." It was not reassuring. Haley called back and heard, beneath the phrase, an attempt to be brave. She thought of the contract that had promised monthly support and the way a paper signature could ease medical bills and perhaps slow the predators that circled them. She thought of the life growing inside her and how the house would see that life as a ledger entry. That morning during a team briefing, a new face drifted into the room like an exhalation. Sarah Duff smiled with a practiced warmth and introduced herself as Sierra Nelson, a new associate from an external partnership. Haley watched the way people leaned in. Sierra, the name was already a puzzle, had a way of making space feel small and private. She spoke of partnerships and synergy, and her resume glittered the way the company liked. Her eyes lingered at Haley in a way Haley could not classify. Not hostile, not kind, just very, very interested. Haley's instincts were thin, like a string pulled taut. She paid attention anyway. "She's from consulting," Anna whispered later at the copier. "Installed by the board." Haley tried to file the detail away, just one more note on the list the house forced her to make. She had begun to notice small omissions. Papers that had been on her desk when she left would be stacked differently when she returned. A coffee cup missing, the lid in a different sink. Once, she opened a drawer where she had placed the silk thread and found it rearranged into a manner she had not done. A man in the security station watched her through a monitor and then turned away. Haley made a mental note of the time and the camera code. If the house was a machine, she thought, then its gears turned without asking whether a person belonged. They only asked whether the person fit. On a Thursday night, the house sang with an event, a small launch party for a new line. They dressed the model in the most luminous stones and invited the people who needed to be reminded that the Lewis name could create desire. Haley went because to be absent from such things would be conspicuous. Anna moved around her like someone rearranging furniture in a thrifted showroom. Sierra, flitted into the conversation, effortless and perfectly placed. At the edge of the party, beneath a balcony, a phone flashed in Haley's bag. It was Cody. She stepped away to read. A message. "Be careful. I saw a delivery van by the east gate. Cameras blocked." It was the kind of note that made blood tighten in the throat. Haley went back to the room and asked for a moment alone. She felt anxiety like another limb. On the steps outside the ballroom, she folded against the rail and breathed. For a second, the house felt like a mouth ready to speak without consent. She thought of telling Charles, of asking the security team to check. Instead, she texted Maya, who answered with the patience of a person who had learned how to keep secrets for others. "I'll look into the cameras," Maya wrote. "Do not go out." When she returned to the party, she found a man leaning near the elevator, and his face flattened into an expression that read like a bow. "Mrs. Lewis," he said. "Mr. Lewis requests you join him in his office." She remembered the pendant around her neck and the way the man had said requests. It was polite coercion dressed as duty. She followed, feet moving through marble that felt like a runway to nowhere. Charles stood by the window, looking out over the city like someone who had once decided it should be ordered. He did not turn when she entered. When he did, his face had an unreadable kindness. "There has been a mix-up at the East Gate," he said simply. "Our cameras cleared. There was nothing to suggest an intrusion." She wanted to tell him about Cody's message, about seeing the van, about the way the security man had watched her, but the words stuck. Instead, she asked quietly, "Do you trust your cameras?" He turned his attention back to the city. "I do," he said. "But I will not be reckless. We will check again tonight." There was an intimacy to that decision she could not name. It might have been only the reflex of a man used to making sure things were closed. Still, when he closed the office door behind him, Haley felt a faint relief. He was a person with power, and he had used it to look at a corner of her life. 3 days later, Haley's morning began with nausea strong enough to pull her from bed. It was early. The mansion was a set of soft lights and measured footsteps. She found herself in the bathroom, and then on her knees in front of the sink, a cold hand at the base of her skull. She thought of nothing as much as the unbearable smallness of her own body. Finally, she forced herself up and, with the shaky resolve of someone making a quiet revolution, took a test she had bought with money she'd saved from her first paycheck. When the result came up positive, she sat down and pressed the test to her chest like a small private miracle. Her hands were trembling, but for a moment, hope and fear were not enemies. She placed a call to Cody, her voice whispering into the speaker. "It's positive." There was a silence on the line that seemed to hold its breath. Then, as if he had been waiting to say the words he had practiced, he whispered, "Haley, I'm right here. Tell me when you tell him." She imagined telling Charles and how his face would not necessarily show the script of what she wanted. Would he be glad? Would this make her even more entangled in the house's warring geography? Grandpa would orbit closer, perhaps, and the house would rearrange itself around a new expectation. Yet the body inside her felt like a compass. It pointed to a life she had not intended, but now could not undo. She did not tell the house. She told Maya and Cody and one person in the design department who had offered in the past to sign things if Haley ever needed cover. She made a list of what would have to be protected. Medical records, prenatal visits, timing logs. She began to think in evidence. That afternoon, an email arrived, a company-wide memo scheduling a private screening of a memorial collection. It meant attendance, photos, a potential headline. Someone would be watching her. In the corner of the memo, a short line from Anna suggested that they maintain continuity in all public images. Haley felt her hands grow cold. She decided she would not be photographed without her consent. She had only begun to shelter the secret when the first war clue unspooled. A photograph appeared on an internal chat, this time taken by someone on the lower staff floor. A shot of a woman's hand, not Haley's, wearing a bracelet similar to the town's boutique line in a car parked near the East Gate, time-stamped earlier that day. The caption read, "Mistimed East Gate activity." The name attached was one Haley did not know. Sierra Nelson. Haley's skin prickled. The uploaded file's metadata was missing the camera ID. Someone had edited it. The simplicity of tampering was both careless and arrogant. Maya texted, heart emojis and a single calm sentence. "Don't panic, I will pull the raw feeds." Before Maya could respond, Anna walked right up to where Haley was sitting and placed a hand on her arm with the kind of pressure that was meant to ask whether she belonged. "You should be careful," Anna said. "People are watching for discrepancies." There was a small public humility in the word. Haley's mouth was dry. She decided then that she would not stand by to be rearranged. She would gather proof. She had learned the handwriting of danger, petty exclusions turning into a net. She had learned that the house could make itself irreproachable in public and merciless in private. She spent the next 2 days collecting what she could. Maya helped by pulling camera timestamps and forwarding them in encrypted messages. Cody helped by running down a contact who knew delivery schedules and might know who had been at the East Gate. A young guard named Julian, someone who had once hidden a sandwich in his locker and joked about the way the job made him feel like a spy, handed her a security log with times that had a gap he could not explain. Haley made a list of names and times and threaded them together like a scarf. Twice she found the name Sierra Nelson connected to someone whose badge was marked for the consulting firm. Twice she found a van on the license plate associated with a small local contractor who had no reason to be there. There were little anomalies, like stitches in an old coat. She saved the files into a folder labeled in plain text, Eastgate. It felt cowardly to make a file like a soldier assembling ammo, but the need to see things in a row made her feel less like a coin in a vault. The day she decided to tell Charles, the sun had a thin, bitter edge. He was in the office late, fingers on the edge of a report. He did not look surprised to see her. He looked only resigned when she said, "We need to talk about the cameras." He listened to her without expression, and then quietly, without the weight of theatrics, he called security and asked for a full audit. "If someone has tampered with systems," he said, "I want it known. I will not have the company used for personal attacks." Haley waited for a ripple of gratitude in his face. What she felt instead was the exacting attention of someone beginning to see an irregularity in a pattern he trusted. He reached for his phone, called a number Haley did not have access to, and ended the conversation before she could probe. "I'll have an answer by this evening," he said. For a moment, Haley allowed herself to hope that the man in the office could be more than an untouchable image, that he might be a man who used his reach to guard rather than to claim. But the house had a long history, and power had a way of bending everything toward its own comfort. The hope did not have time to root. That night, driving home from a late shift at the studio, she had insisted on staying late to avoid the press at the launch. She found the world arranged wrong. The steering felt loose, as if the car were deciding its own path. Haley's hands fought the wheel, headlights in the oncoming lane splintered like knives. The vehicle rolled in a direction she had not chosen. The world outside unstitched itself into a smear of metal and light. Everything after that was a soft rush. Cody's voice on her phone, then a thumping in her ear, then the smell of burnt rubber and antiseptic. The paramedics moved with efficient kindness. Someone spoke her name like an incantation. She pressed a hand to her abdomen. There was a hum in her ears. The world collapsed into the narrow focus of breath and the bright clinical alienation of hospital lights. When she woke in a bed that was too white and too fast, monitors hissed under her skin. A nurse hovered, gentle and solemn. Charles stood at the foot of the bed, an image of composure splintered by something like worry. He had one hand on the railing, knuckles white, the other fidgeting with the pendant at his throat. Haley's mouth tasted of copper. She tried to speak, the word a rasp. "What happened?" she asked. "You were in an accident," the nurse said. Her tone was careful. "You were brought in by ambulance. You've suffered trauma and there's been some blood loss. We're monitoring you and the baby." Haley's mind latched to the single thread. The baby. She felt it like a question puffing out of a candle. The nurse adjusted a strap on the monitor. A line on the screen made a steady wave. Charles did not meet her eyes. Instead, he turned to the app on his phone and scrolled through images as if searching for a confirmation to the story he had been given. There was a man in a suit she did not recognize hovering near the door. He placed his face in the shadow of the frame and watched as if watching a scene from someone else's life. He introduced himself as an estate manager, but the way he carried himself read like a man who belonged to the house and therefore to the story. Haley felt a swell of something between fury and fear. She remembered the odd van by the East Gate. She remembered the camera timestamps and the gaps. The rustle of the past days came back like a film reel. She was not safe in the house no matter how many men stood outside the doors. "Who called?" she asked, her voice small and fierce. "Cody? Maya?" Charles looked at her then, and the thing in his eyes was complicated. "Cody was called at the scene," he said. "He was there before the ambulance. He called for you as soon as he could." Haley's gaze dropped to the monitor. The rhythm was steady. For a second she allowed herself to imagine the narrative that would be stitched for her. A tragic accident, an unfortunate timing, a woman who had been unlucky. She wanted to tell the whole truth in the instant she could. The camera footage, the van, the odd edits. But the words would be picked at and reassembled against her. She had to be careful. A doctor came in, his expression brisk and exhausted. He read notes off a tablet. "There's no doubt we stabilized her," he said. "We will need to run more tests for internal bleeding and to monitor fetal viability. We'll be cautious." Haley felt the words as a cliff edge. The nurse's eyes were kind. "We will do everything we can," she said, "but kindness does not always equal promises." Outside in the hallway, a shadow moved and a person spoke in a low tone that Haley couldn't make out. Later she would replay the scene in her head until the words jagged. "Timeline," the voice said. "We need to be sure." Haley's throat closed. Someone was already shaping the narrative. Already the law of the house and the language of proof were pressing in. Charles reached for her hand then, where the pendant rested at the hollow of her collarbone. He did not speak, only tightened his fingers as if that were an argument. His face softened with an expression Haley had not seen before. Not for the cameras, not for the board, but private and raw, as if something had been hit by a small sudden weather. "I'll be here," he said, the words leveled like a promise that was not framed by contract. "You are in the hospital. You are not alone." Her gaze fixed on him. In that moment, outside the ebb and flow of power, he looked less like an untouchable image and more like someone who might be willing to break his own rules. But the house was patient. It kept its rules and fed the world a version that was easier to swallow. As the doctor finished his examination, he said something that sounded as if it were meant for a record rather than a person. "We'll need to verify the prenatal records," he said with the professional flatness of someone who operated by evidence. "Timelines matter for determining the course of treatment." Haley's heart lurched. "Prenatal records?" she echoed. "Yes," he said. "We need to review the records you have and the ones from any other prior care to ensure alignment. It helps us make informed decisions." The nurse squeezed Haley's hand with a softness that was both a comfort and a reminder. Someone was already moving to catalogue the state of her life. Someone would put a stamp on the truth. Haley thought of the list she had been constructing, the files she had saved, the camera logs folded like a talisman in her phone. She thought of the van and the man in the shadow. The house had been building a case, and if she did not swing the light to the cracks fast enough, the house would finish the story for her. When Charles left the room to speak to the doctor privately, Haley tried to sit up and retch out the panic that had begun to pool. Her phone lay on the bedside table like a small, stubborn son. She reached for it and opened the folder labeled Eastgate. There was one file she had not yet sent to anyone. The footage she had managed to save had a gap precisely where the van had been. She hit play and watched the rectangle of pixels skip at the moment her car should have moved freely. Then a new message slid into her inbox like a bell. An anonymous email, subject line, timeline. The body contained only one sentence and one image. A screen capture of hospital intake paperwork with an entry that she did not recognize and a date that implied something that had not occurred yet. Haley felt something cold move through her like a warning. She had started a fight she did not know how to finish. The house could count on the fact that a hospital would consult paperwork and that paperwork could be adjusted. She pressed her thumb to the pendant at her throat and thought of the signature she had made in the rain. She thought of the way the house swallowed and respit its people. She thought of Cody at the scene, and of Maya's steady hands pulling camera frames, and of her own body, small against the machine of a family that had always known how to organize truth. Outside, behind the glass of the corridor, a woman Haley had seen before in the design studio, Sarah Duff, or Sierra Nelson, the name a shifting glass, watched through a seam of light. She raised a hand in a small, polite arc. Haley could not tell whether the woman's smile reached her eyes or stopped at the edges. The hospital hummed its expectant music. In the distance someone said the word timeline again, sharp as a knife being drawn. Haley's breath hitched. She had bargained for safety and bought herself into a gilded cage. Now she realized that the cage had rooms that were mosquito net thin, letting in insects of rumor and forged documents that could bite deep. Haley closed her eyes and let the present compress to a single thought. She would not be made into a story someone else told. She would learn to read the house's handwriting and to write back. She reached for the nurse's call button, then thought better of calling someone who might act as an editor to the narrative. Instead, she took a breath and slid the phone under her pillow with the file still open, a small heartbeat of evidence folded into cotton. If the house wanted a story, she would give it a fight. Doors opened and shut. Footsteps walked like distant drums. Charles returned to the bed with 2 cups of tea, and a look that suggested fatigue and disbelief collided and produced something like concern. "I have asked for a full audit of the security logs," he said. "We will get to the bottom of the East Gate. We will find out what happened." Haley watched him, and for a beat believed in the power of a man to effect change. But she had learned to live by evidence, not hope. Later that night, as the monitors kept time with the slow tide of her heart, someone at the nurse's station muttered the word timeline again, and the syllable landed like a stone. Haley felt the steady beep of the machines under her palm, and thought of the thin folder labeled Eastgate tucked into the pillow beneath her phone, a small stubborn archive of anomalies she had collected like coins. The house would try to tell a story. She would not let them publish it without a footnote. She slept in restless fragments. Dreams were punctuated by marble floors and the flash of headlights. Cody's voice threaded through them, calm, practical. Maya's text buzzed with clipped updates. Found tamper signature in footage, meet tomorrow. Julian, the young guard, had slipped her a photocopy of a log with a hole in it where the van should have been. It was small proof, and that was all she had to begin. Morning arrived in strips of fluorescent light. The doctor came and spoke in an official voice about scans and risks and standard procedure. He did not promise miracles. The nurse checked the fetal monitor, and the line curved the way lines do when held in something steady. "The heart rate is strong," she said, careful not to be overassuring. Haley tightened her fingers around the pendant at her throat, not letting go. Charles stayed. He did not hover in a performative way. He simply placed himself within reach, a presence that felt like a decision. When he spoke, it was practical, not ceremonial. "I've had the security audit expedited," he said. "I've asked for raw footage from all angles, no edits. Whatever was done, we'll see it." Haley heard the promise and the measurement behind it. He had the reach. The question was whether he would point it at the right place. They began to collect. Maya came with a thumb drive and a face that had been privy to too many small violences to be surprised by anything. "I pulled what I could," she said, setting the drive on the bedside table like an offering. "There are gaps. And look!" She played a clip on Charles's tablet. The footage was grainy and corporate, a gray rectangle with unhelpful angles. At first it seemed like nothing. Then the frame hiccuped, a full second gone. The timestamp jumped, resuming with a different angle. Someone had spliced the feed. The edit was crude. The cut was not seamless. "You're sure that's not a camera malfunction?" Charles asked, voice low. Maya shook her head. "Someone re-rendered the footage. The metadata doesn't match camera logs." Haley felt a small, fierce joy. Proof was not dramatic. It was a calibration error someone assumed no one would look for. Cody arrived, cheeks flamed from haste, carrying a folder that smelled faintly of grease and cheap coffee. "I talked to Tony," he said without preface. "He remembers the van, same plate I gave you. He says the driver was nervous, said something about job done." Haley swallowed. "Job done for whom?" Cody shrugged. "I don't know, but Tony knows faces. He'll pick the driver out of a lineup." The audit wound its way through polite channels. Heads of departments, security logs, legal counsel. Charles used the corporate resources with a measured intensity. He was both chairman and a man suddenly willing to be inconvenienced. He pulled financial records, pushed for unredacted backups, and asked for house access logs. Each request set a ripple through the family staff. Questions that had been murmured in corners were now recorded in memos and forwarded to lawyers. That alone changed the tenor in the mansion. Haley worked with slow precision. She backed up the Eastgate file to a secondary account and printed hard copies of anything that could be physically stored, timelines, timestamps, phone numbers. There was a voice in the back of her head that said, "Keep it off estate servers." There was a louder voice that said, "Keep it where people physically could not erase it." She followed both. Days blurred into a pattern of forensics and fear. The hospital team monitored her closely. The baby's heartbeat stayed steady, and the doctors, pragmatic and reserved, spoke in measured probabilities rather than promises. Then came the blow. The scans revealed internal scarring from the accident. It suggested trauma that might have endangered a pregnancy. The language of risk became a daily liturgy. There were tears she let fall alone, when no one watched. 2 weeks after the accident, a new wound of betrayal opened wider. An internal memo marked "confidential" landed in the company's PR channel and then somehow spread beyond it. The document listed attendance at the launch party and included a doctored photo of Haley at the East Gate, overlaying a timestamp that suggested she had been away from the mansion at a time that the raw feeds showed she had not. The memo attached a scanned prenatal chart with handwriting that did not match the hospital's standard records, an entry dated before her confirmed test, a note implying late conception. Haley felt as if the house had breathed into a microphone and exhaled her name with bias. The forged chart was precise, the kind of thing a savvy forger could produce. It was designed to create doubt, about dates, about fidelity, about who the father might be. In a family obsessed with lineage, doubt was a weapon. "They're trying to shift the timeline," Maya said, voice tight. "Make it look like the pregnancy couldn't possibly be this far along." Haley's stomach dropped into the hollow she had walked out of months ago. "Who would benefit?" she asked. Maya's eyes flicked to the doorway. "Someone who wanted to put you offside, someone who wants the heir to be someone else, or no heir at all until their plan is clear." That was the moment Haley understood the depth of the calculus. This was not random cruelty. This was direction. The narrative of her body and the timing of her life were being weaponized. She stopped sleeping more than a little each night. She copied everything. Cody sat on the edge of her hospital chair and pitched possibilities. "We need a PI," he said finally. "Someone who can trace the money, the plates, someone who knows how to talk to people who don't want to be found." Haley hesitated. Inviting another person into the house risked more exposure, but the files under her pillow had already shown her that the house would act whether she let it in or not. "Get me someone discreet," she said. "No headlines." Cody made a few calls, and the next morning a woman in a plain coat arrived at the hospital with a neutral expression and a datapad. Her name was Elise Marlowe, an investigator who specialized in corporate skullduggery. She looked at Haley with steady professional curiosity. "We'll work off the patterns," Elise said. "Forgeries leave signatures, font inconsistencies, compression artifacts in images, metadata noise, payment trails leak. People like to be paid in the same little ways. We'll start with the obvious and let it widen." Permission was not a luxury Haley could afford. She signed what needed signing and let Elise begin. Meanwhile, Charles gave Haley access to his internal counsel, and for the first time, she watched him put his weight beyond the house's polite fences. He was a man who could summon auditors and legal men. He chose to point them in her direction. But the house pushed back. Someone leaked the story of conflicting prenatal records to an online tabloid with a taste for scandal. Overnight, the internet filled with the same old moralizing commentary about women and marriage and timing. Haley watched it happen like an aneurysm, a small pressure point, and then an explosion that made simple things ache. She felt the cold of public opinion squeeze. She kept her head down. Cody and Maya rallied. Julian, the guard, texted pictures of a maintenance key taped under a dumpster and a photo of a delivery slip signed by a subcontractor who had no contract. Elise traced the delivery company and found a shell corporation with payments traced back to an unassuming account. The account name was a nominee. The trail ran through a network of micropayments and ended in a known escrow used by a particular private investigator the company had employed before. The penny dropped. Someone had rehired ways of hiding payments. Elise pushed for a subpoena against the shell, and, once granted, the bank transaction revealed a larger pattern. A wire to a personal account registered to a woman named Sarah Duff. Sarah, however, did not exist in the public records as Sarah Duff. She appeared in company documents as Sierra Nelson Consultant. The two names matched photographs that were, on the surface, different. On closer inspection, facial surgery clinics and social media filters could explain small discrepancies. But the handwriting on the forged prenatal chart? It matched a document service used by Sarah's previous employer. The forger's thumbprint, if you could call digital traces that, led back to Sarah. Elise found more. Security footage from a private clinic showed Sarah arriving late at night. A maintenance camera outside a storage room in the mansion captured a figure with a hood leaving the grounds at odd hours. The van license matched Tony's description. Each thread pulled at another. Haley felt vindicated and afraid. Evidence did not change the charge in the court of public opinion, but it changed the legal weight in the room. Then the worst thing the house could arrange happened, an attempted poisoning. The morning it occurred, Haley woke with a nausea unlike any she had felt before. The nausea was more than residual from the scans. It was sharp, concentrated, like a hand had closed around the base of her skull. The nurse called it a flare. Doctors ordered blood tests as a precaution. The line on the monitor wavered. At midday, a tray of tea arrived, labeled with a small sticker and an imprint of the catering company. Haley sipped. It tasted bitter and wrong. She reached for the glass and then stopped. Someone in the wings had anticipated this reaction. A mistake in labeling had been made visible for a reason Haley couldn't yet conceive. She set the cup down, palms damp. Then a sudden weakness swept her, dizzy, fogged, and she collapsed into a chair. Alarms rose, the nurse shouted, the monitor's line trembled. Doctors flooded the room with efficient commands. They ran blood work, placed an IV, called toxicology. Charles arrived in a flurry and took charge with terrifying clarity. He barked orders with a voice that had always been used to being obeyed. The team moved with a practiced speed that kept the worst at bay. They flushed her system, administered activated charcoal, and stabilized her. The hospital took samples and sealed them. Forensics would take over. The poisoning was an act of malice clear as a blade. Haley's panic cleaved into two parts: the immediate fear of what had been in her system and the cold recognition that someone had crossed a line that could have taken her life. That recognition was well-calibrated terror. The toxicology report came back. Traces consistent with a sedative and a substance used to mimic gastrointestinal upset. The levels had been enough to seriously jeopardize the pregnancy if untreated. The team said the response had likely prevented the worst. Charles gripped Haley's hand with an intensity that stripped away the measured persona. "Who would do this?" he demanded, not as a CEO but as a man who had almost lost the woman in his bed. Haley thought of the cup, the label, the way the catering slips had been rerouted. Elise dug into delivery manifests and staff logs and found a key piece of material evidence. CCTV from a corridor outside the kitchen captured a maintenance staff member moving a tray. The maintenance man's face was blurred by distance, but a distinct tattoo on his wrist, 3 dots clustered in a triangle, appeared. Elise traced the maintenance schedule, found the worker, and tracked him to a temporary subcontractor roster. He was a courier who, under the pressure of questioning, admitted to being paid by a woman who said, "Fix what needs fixing." The courier fingered a name: Sarah. When confronted, Sarah's composure wavered like a reflection on water. She had been careful, but not careful enough. Confrontations are strange things. They make liars small in ways the courtroom never quite does. Under pressure, Sarah insisted she had acted alone, for reasons of personal debt and revenge against the family for a past grievance. When detectives checked her apartment for more evidence, they found notebooks with phone numbers and a ledger of payments, some of them small, frequent transfers from an account bearing Will Duncan's initials. Will's name hit Haley like a physical blow. She had suspected him all along, knew his greed and venom, but she had never pictured him in the inner mechanics of a conspiracy that would seek to harm her. Elise, calling in favors, had traced a circumstantial, uncomfortable chain of cash movements. A few payments from Will's account to the shell company and the shell to Sarah. Not proof of the poisoning itself. Forensic labs would have to tie the sedative source to the procurement, but enough to constitute probable cause. Detectives came. They asked questions and they listened. Will denied everything. He disappeared for a day, then reappeared to hand over his phone under the advice of counsel. The call detail revealed an exchange, a short string of transfers and a voicemail where Will's voice, rough and urgent, could be heard saying, "Make it look like an accident. We can't have an air until we're set." Haley replayed the message in the small quiet of a conference room with Elise and watched Will's career and a battered family ledger come into brutal relief. The audio had been a smoking gun, not because it shouted with confession, but because it showed motive and connection. The detectives moved quickly. They arrested Sarah, not only for falsifying records, but for attempted poisoning. Will followed on charges of conspiracy and solicitation. The house convulsed. Arrests made the quiet corridors noisy. Staff whispered. The tabloids, which had smelled scandal, now smelled crime. The Lewis name sat under new, harsher lights. Charles's side of the family split. Some rallied around the sanctity of their name, some around the idea that it had been a few bad actors. Grandpa Lewis, who had called for an heir but who had never asked for blood, sat in his study and listened like a judge. He surprised Haley in a way small and enormous. He walked into the room where Charles and Haley met with Elise and the detectives and placed his hand on Haley's shoulder. "This family has been greedy long before you arrived," he said softly. "Not defense, but confession. I have tried to protect it. I will not protect those who corrupt it." In that moment, Haley felt the house give up a little of its hold. Truth has gravity, and gravity began to pull hard. The prosecution's case moved forward on multiple pillars: the digital forensics showing altered footage, the bank transfers into shell accounts, the courier's testimony tying Sarah to payments, and the forensic lab's confirmation that the cup had been contaminated with a sedative traced to a supplier Sarah used. Forgeries were laid bare by forensic handwriting analysis and metadata experts who testified about file compression signatures. The hospital records that Sarah had attempted to alter were recovered from backups. A database administrator produced unedited logs. Each piece fit. The legal machinery, when pointed at corruption, can be slow, but it is inexorable. Charles did his part. He released privilege where needed and publicly distanced himself from those implicated. He sat in meetings with attorneys and pleaded for expediency. He had the means to fight a smear campaign. He used those means to chase truth. As the court dates closed in, the mansion felt like a house that had been washed. Not clean, but honest about its dirt. Staff rearranged routines. Anna, who had been sharp and cruel, found herself publicly shamed when a call she had made to a gossip column was uncovered. She lost her privilege at the company and was transferred to an overseas affiliate. It was not the same as arrest, but it was consequence, and yet, beneath the legal movement, the more intimate wounds held. Haley had been harmed in ways records couldn't fully measure. She had lost the naive possibility that a life could be purchased and come with safety. She had been nearly killed. She had lost, in private grief, something she had not named to others. In one ultrasound after the accident, the doctors had told them they had likely lost one of a possible pair. The image had been small and solemn and left a hollow that didn't have words. Later scans confirmed a single heartbeat. The doctor had used the phrase selective loss in a tone like a pale apology. It was a grief that did not fit headlines, only rooms. The grieving was private. Cody sat with her in the evenings and let her talk without finishing sentences. When she cried, he did not ask to solve anything. Maya brought extra blankets and kept her food trays warm. Charles stood at a measured distance until a small, pivotal moment when he crossed it. They were in the mansion library, a room of wood and mild, patient light. Charles had been quiet. Haley had watched him through the storm like someone studying a map. He picked up the pendant she had been given and turned it in his hands. The jade shone dull and conventional. "Why did your grandmother give me this?" Haley asked at last, voice hollow with the kind of fatigue grief builds. Charles looked up, vulnerability cutting through his usual composure. "It was supposed to be a legacy piece," he said. "To mark family. She thought it would give someone steadiness. Not this kind." Haley's laugh came out small and brittle. "It looks more like a surveillance chip sometimes," she said. He reached across the table and placed both hands on her free one. "I should have noticed sooner," he said. "When you first arrived, I thought—" He stopped. The sentence hung in the air like something that needed to be cleansed of phrase. I thought I was protecting the company. I didn't see the ways the company protected itself at any cost. I'm sorry. Words that are genuine are rare. Haley felt the shift like a window opening. It wasn't absolution for what had been done, but it was the start of something else. An admission that he could be more than the image had told. They spent long afternoons with Elise going over timelines and talking strategy. Elise encouraged Haley to be part of the prosecution process, to give a statement and be present when the forgeries were explained in court. You need to be the one who ties the narrative together, Elise said, not just for the law, but for whoever reads the record after. Haley did not want the theater of it, but she wanted justice. She testified with a voice that sometimes wavered and sometimes sharpened like wire. She read aloud the entries she had backed up. She showed the camera logs and the courier's testimony. She let the world see the details she had been forced to keep. It was in the courtroom, under dry lights, and with an audience that wore a stranger's curiosity, that a piece of evidence shifted everything. The prosecution played a single video, grainy, taken from a back corridor camera in the mansion. For 2 minutes, it showed Sarah moving through service halls, then stopping by a locked supply room, opening it with a key she shouldn't have had. On her sleeve, a flash of ink, 3 dots clustered in a triangle, the same as the courier's tattoo. The clip showed Sarah opening a cabinet, removing a jar of medication, then slipping it into her bag. The clip cut. The defense tried to argue coincidence. The courier's testimony, the bank trails, the audio message from Will, and Sarah's own partial admissions made that difficult. The jury saw patterns. The jury liked patterns. When the verdict came, it was not a miracle but a certainty. Sarah Duff was convicted on multiple counts, and Will Duncan faced charges that included solicitation of a felony and conspiracy. The courtroom's atmosphere was taut when the judge read the sentence. For Haley, the sound of consequence was a small, precise comfort. After the arrests, the Lewis household fragmented in a way that resembled repair more than shattering. Grandpa Lewis, chastened and private, said little in public but spent long afternoons in the garden with Haley, asking about things unrelated to chancery or lineage, about her childhood, about a recipe her mother used to make. Those conversations were awkward attempts at something like restitution. They didn't erase what had happened, but they were gestures of humanity. Charles, meanwhile, announced a restructuring at the company. He put safeguards in place, independent audits, checks on payments, limits on who could access private security footage. He fired a few people who had crossed ethical lines and personally provided legal support for the staff who had been dragged into the scandal. Publicly, he apologized for the way the family had allowed its reputation to be above accountability. The question of their marriage remained. The contract that had brought Haley into the mansion remained a legal document, but its moral force had withered in the face of truth. Haley could have walked away, taken the compensation, and recovered her life somewhere quieter. She considered the option with a sharp, practical eye. Cody suggested she take time. Elise offered to help secure a settlement and protections. Julian sent a note. Whatever you choose, you earned the right to choose it. The choice mattered not because it was romantic, but because it would be a statement of agency. Haley did not owe Charles a life for his apologies. She owed herself a reckoning. In the weeks after the verdict, they negotiated. Haley insisted on terms that protected her and her child. A transfer of the small penthouse Charles had been prepared to offer. A trust in her name with clear provisions, and a legal agreement that gave her final say on any public image that used her name. She asked for security steps, certain house access revoked for specified family members, an independent ombudsman for the company, and funds for a private counselor for her family. Charles read each clause and offered no resistance. He signed. "You're not bargaining from weakness," he said once, voice low. "You're taking what's yours." She was. The settlement was not about ransom, it was about autonomy. When she asked that her name be publicly cleared and that Charles use his influence to correct false reporting, he agreed without flourish. Where his family had once protected their own, he now used that protection differently. The days that followed were quieter by degrees. Haley had recovery to navigate, medical checks, therapy for the trauma, and the slow, stubborn work of knitting a life back together. She spent mornings visiting her mother, whose cancer treatments had been covered in part by the funds Charles's support enabled. She began to write checks for her brother's tuition. she met with Cody on the stoop of a deli and let him make her laugh with a ridiculous story about a broken muffler. Life, small and often inconvenient, returned. There were public moments that tested them. A tabloid tried to run a speculative piece about internal family vendettas. Charles recorded a short statement condemning the breach of trust and the real crimes committed and called for it to be retracted. Grandpa Lewis sent a letter to staff offering an apology and a commitment to change. The company instituted an ethics hotline, something it had never had before. The final confrontation that closed the open wounds of the story took place not in a courtroom, but in a small conference room at the hospital, where evidence had been compiled with the sober attention of professionals. Sarah, handcuffed at the wrist, sat across the table, her face a study in exhaustion. Will sat too, defiant and small. Detectives, Elise, a company attorney, and a prosecutor were present. Haley had chosen to be there, not as a spectacle but as a witness to the shape of consequence. The prosecutor read a brief of facts. A recorded phone call was played, Sarah's voice, brittle, admitting to making an accident in a conversation with Will. Forensics had already tied the sedative to a supplier on Sarah's ledger. The forged documents were traced through the digital signatures Sarah had used to a computer with an IP address that matched login attempts from a device registered to Will. When the prosecutor finished, the room smelled of disinfectant and resolved things. Haley watched the two people who had shaped so much of her fear reduced to the edges of the law. They would pay, the law would make them accountable. Afterwards, Charles walked Haley to the elevator. He did not speak of apologies again, he spoke of choices. What you did, bringing the evidence, staying in the fight, that was strength I should have seen sooner, he said. Haley looked at him with something even-handed. You did something too, she said. You could have done nothing, you chose the other way. He nodded. I chose wrong at first, he admitted. But I didn't choose to repeat it. Will you? He let the question drop into the space between them, an unfinished sentence. It did not have to be romantic, but it also did not have to be a denial. Haley considered the future like a map she had the right to redraw. She thought of the pendant at her throat and the way it had once seemed an anchor. Now it felt like a reminder. She held out her hand. Let's build from here, she said. With rules. He took it, and his fingers closed the way they had in the library that day. Careful, intentional, not possessive. They would rebuild not on the shaky scaffolding of secrecy, but on the hard work of accountability. It was not a fairy tale reconciliation. It was a negotiation between two people who had been through a war and wanted different things afterward. Months later, the mansion had new rhythms. Places that had been private were audited. Staff who had blurred lines were gone. Anna was overseas and anonymous. Julian, the guard, received a promotion for his honesty. Maya moved to a managerial role overseeing studio ethics. Cody got a small business loan from an account Charles insisted he allow. That was the man's version of reparation. He wouldn't call it a favor. Haley settled into a life that was both quieter and more vigilant. She decorated the penthouse she had been given with thrifted plates and a new rug she had chosen with her own hands. The jade pendant stayed at her throat more often as a talisman than a chain. She called her mother every other day and sat with her in the hospital waiting room through an infusion of chemo, passing the hours with talk of trivial things. The way the sun hit the window at a particular hour, a recipe for tomato soup. When the legal dust settled, Sarah and Will were behind bars, sentences handed down that were neither lenient nor excessive. The tabloids that had once fed on rumors now ran follow-up pieces on corporate reform. The Lewis Company instituted transparent thinking. Grandpa planted a tree in the garden and asked Haley to join him for the first time. She did. On an ordinary morning, Haley walked the hushed hallway of the mansion toward the garden. Charles met her there with a thermos and 2 cups. They sat on a bench where the sun filtered through new leaves. The baby inside her moved with a small, precise kick that felt like punctuation. I was worried you'd change your mind, he admitted, voice low. That you would take everything and leave. Haley smiled, small and certain. I could have, she said. But I chose differently. Not because this place is perfect, but because I believe people can be better than their worst choices. He looked at her with an intensity that had softened into something like partnership. Then let's be better together, he said. They did not promise forever in a single grand line. They made smaller vows. Listen before assuming, share information openly, never allow family business to trump safety, and keep the house accountable. Those vows were practical and unglamorous, and therefore they felt like the right kind. Months passed, and the baby came in a quiet room with a midwife and a doctor who had followed Haley's case through every scan. The labor was long. Haley gripped the hand of a woman who had once been nameless in the design studio and had become a friend. Cody sat outside the delivery room and refused to come in because he cried too easily. Charles paced until the nurse told him to sit and breathe. Grandpa waited in the lobby as if every step toward parenthood was a minor miracle. When the child arrived, small, loud, and perfectly alive, Haley felt a kind of joy that was rude and unembarrassed. She named the baby in a private way, a name that meant nothing to any ledger and everything to a family kitchen. It was a choice that belonged to her. The exposure of the secrets, identity forgeries, bank trails, and attempted murder had stripped the untouchable image from Charles in the way that matter-of-fact light strips lacquer from an old table. What remained was a man who had power but had learned the cost of power used for protection rather than for dominance. The Lewis name stopped being an armor and became slowly a responsibility. At the end, Haley's marriage was no longer an arrangement forced by a signed line in shuttered courthouses. It was a contract rewritten, mutual, negotiated and fragile. It was, importantly, hers. One evening, months after the verdict, she walked through the design studio where Maya now led a small ethics committee for design approvals. Anna's old desk sat empty. A new team, diverse, practical, pushed a window of prototypes toward her. They listened to her feedback, respectful and curious. Haley thought of all the forces that had pushed and pulled her life in the last year and felt the shape of her choices settle like a cloak. She felt something like relief and the edge of a new steadiness. The jade pendant still swung at her throat. Sometimes, when the house hummed with sound and memory, she touched it and remembered the contract that had bought safety with shame. She had reclaimed more than comfort now. She had reclaimed agency. The truth, once revealed, did its work. It was messy and real. It did not unmake the pain, but it made space for healing and for accountability. Haley had been forced into marriage to buy time for her family. In the process of surviving, investigating, confronting, and choosing, she discovered not only the hidden crimes lodged in the mansion's gilded bowels, but also a version of herself that could demand justice and custom-tailor a future. She kept a corner in her mind reserved for memory, of the shipping van at the East Gate, of the hospital monitors, of the small folder stuffed under her pillow. Those things would remain. But so would something else, an odd collection of ordinary mornings, the smell of tomato soup in a small penthouse, the sound of her child's breathing at night, the steady hand of a partner who had learned to choose. If you want to see how Haley rebuilds her life and the new rules that grow out of the rubble, subscribe and follow the next chapter. They did not live in a storybook. They lived in a house that had been forced to tell the truth, and in that telling, Haley found a place to stand. The billionaire who had once been untouchable now carried the weight of being accountable. The secrets that had nearly cost them everything had been laid open, and consequence, legal, social, personal, had followed. Haley had entered as a woman making a sacrifice. She left as a person who had bargained for dignity and won the terms. On an ordinary morning, she stood by the kitchen window in the penthouse, watching the light hit the city. Charles brought her a cup of coffee and handed it to her without pretense. Grandpa called to ask after the baby. Cody sent a photo of a newly installed sign at his shop. Elise sent a terse email about closing files. Haley smiled, a small private work of art. When she placed a hand on her child's tiny back later that day, the world narrowed to the perfect warm weight of the small life she had saved. It had not been easy, and it had not been clean, but it was hers, and that fact mattered more than anything else. Outside, the Lewis name continued to glitter on facades. Inside, the house had been rearranged to make room for truth. The pendant at Haley's throat chimed once in the afternoon sun, not as a chain of possession, but as a memory of the bargains that had changed everything. She touched it, and the sound was gentle, like something closing softly on the page of a book that had finally been read.